All right, so we left off last time wrapping up the forms of government and how they become perverse. And so now we're looking at the flow of power. We see on the map here a familiar image, the red and the blue. We might as well just be able to have a big boy conversation about that. And those are circles, and this is a cross section representing certain numbers, and of course you won't know what that is quite yet until we get into it. So the perennial question, and it doesn't matter which political philosopher asks this, because any political philosopher that's worth anything has asked this question, and that is really what makes the difference between those positive forms and the perverse forms as they degenerate into tyranny. And one political philosopher puts it in this way: how can those who are invested with the powers of government be prevented from employing them as the means of aggrandizing themselves instead of using them to protect and preserve society? Well, you try to solve that problem. There's a way to shoot too high and to shoot too low. You could say, well, we'll put a power over them. But of course, that leads to an infinite regress of, if they are checking those with power because they have power to do so, who's checking them? And then on the other hand, well, we can give them such a weak amount of power that it makes it pointless, and they don't even have the power to do what we've given them to do. So you have those two extremes, and that's been a conundrum in really the history of all of political thought. So, in what ways does power tend one way or the other? That's what we're asking here, and one of the ways that I've sought to answer that, I created a little parable that I've shared with my son and with others in civics classes in the past. And I think I got it from Milton Friedman, not the parable, but the principle. But as I read him, I realized pretty quickly that he and a lot of others got the principle from Aristotle. And the parable is what I call the lawnmower parable. And what I do is I ask somebody, if I own a lawnmower, when can I use that lawnmower? And how can I use it? And the answer is however you want and whenever you want. Okay, that's easy enough. But supposing for whatever reason I decide to share that lawnmower with my next door neighbor. And then, of course, the answer is, well, it's still pretty doable. You just have to coordinate it. If for whatever reason you're renting it or you purchased it half and half with that person, yeah, it's still pretty workable. You use it whenever you want to. Obviously one of you has to decide who's going to store it in their garage and who's not, and all that stuff. Okay. Well, let's say we expand this a little bit to just the people on our side of the block, about 6 households. And then you realize, okay, that's still pretty doable, but you really have to start keeping track. Who does store this? Or perhaps it is in a storage unit, and you share the cost of that, if that's convenient. And they say, well, what about if I expand this to our entire block, both sides? And now we're looking at 20 to 30 to 40 households. And all of a sudden you got yourself a storage bin, and perhaps one of those enterprising teenagers or whatever that's not quite ready to do his own lawn service, but you hire him out both to store it and to mow the lawn. And of course, he now has to be the one to keep track of whose day it is to use and all that stuff. And then you can multiply that. Now suppose I want to extend this to my entire subdivision, and I don't even know how many people that is, but you're looking at 1,000 perhaps. And then whose lawnmower is it now? Well, you can, I don't even know. The guy schedules 6 or 7 people a day, once a month or something like that, and now all of a sudden your lawn is suffering as well, on top of all the other things that you farmed out. Now, what is the point of this parable? Well, it's simply this: when everybody owns something, nobody really owns that thing, and nobody is charged with the keeping, the maintenance. Oh, you've hired somebody else to do that. And even the excellence suffers. So as it grows distant or over a larger sphere, you have those problems not only with efficiency, but with ownership. And so what I'm trying to show in that parable was said long ago by Aristotle in his Politics, in his maxim of ownership. And it is this. He says, what belongs in common to the most people is accorded the least care. They take thought of their own things above all, and less about things in common, or only so much as falls to each individually. For apart from other things, they slight them on the grounds that someone else is taking thought for them. And then Aristotle moves on to compare the statesmen, or perhaps in the modern world, we can throw in the bureaucratic elite, and compare them to a house servant. We begin as the owners, as the one who should take ownership. We begin to slothfully presume. We begin to lose our vigilance. And there are no shortage of areas where this does not come home to roost. There's a reason why public housing immediately deteriorates as opposed to privately owned, or land. It is why those who carp the most about pollution in the collectivist economies are by far and away, and there's no comparison, the biggest polluters. And you say, well, that's counterintuitive. Well, no doubt it is, if your worldview does not take that concept into account. It's why crime, it's why in the inner city or anywhere else you measure it, the more that the public spends on public education, the less in those areas tends to get into the classroom. You know, you can only beat yourself up against the head 30, 40, 50 years poring over the statistics to say, well, something must be wrong in my assumptions. And you are correct if you ever do ask that question, and you should. When everybody owns something, nobody owns that thing. Excellence goes down the toilet, and ownership gets farmed out to some elite who also have an interest just as you have an interest. Remember your doctrine of sin. Now, Aristotle also spoke about the need for a strong middle class for this very reason. Same thing, checks and balances. That's really what's happening here. All these things are being talked about because they have in their minds, the great political theorists do, power. And not only power as an object, but the flow of power, the natural tendency, like water seeking its lowest plane, in the same way, and just as objectively, I should say, really, the flow of power is an object of reflection in political theory. Aristotle says there should be a strong middle class. Why? Because the richest, and especially those who've inherited, are already indolent, and the propertyless able to be whipped into a mob, and we talked about that last time. And this idea was captured best by James Madison in his concern for factions in Federalist paper number 10. And he defined factions as, quote, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority, doesn't matter. They're just a group of citizens of the whole, out of the whole. And so you could represent them by circles too instead of geographic interests. But they're factions who, Madison says, are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. In other words, it's what we called in the last century special interest groups, or as we now call it, identity politics. But such is violence that the demagogue can now tap. Such does not lead to violence. It just so happens to get out of the cage and at the end stage become violent. But such is at the DNA level violence against the image of God. And that's what Madison called factions. Now, what Aristotle and many others saw is that there is an inverse relationship between that middle class, or that reasonable prosperity and upward mobility on the one hand, and any impetus for factions to begin on the other. And you might be listening to this and saying, a middle class, well, that's just your bourgeois version of your special interest group, namely those who have property and got it no merit of their own. We're back to the Rawls definition of social justice. But that's actually not, and of course, when you view the world like that, naturally you're going to hear others through that filter, through that lens, but that's actually not what Aristotle or Madison or anybody else meant by middle class. They meant something more like an open field, and the freer and more open it is, the better, because then you don't have the occasion for factions to start, or for people to begin to look at themselves primarily as a battering ram team against the federal piñata, where other images of God are there only to bludgeon and to get your fair share. Okay, so if there's a vibrant middle class, namely an open field in which people can participate, that there's an inverse relationship between that and the impetus or the catalyst for factions to get going. And so Aristotle's solution, beyond that, we can talk about economics later, but at this point, all we're looking at is the flow of power in relation to size or scope. His solution did involve forms of government. He said, well, you've got to have a combination, a mixed form of government is really the best. And I think even as we saw, Calvin gave a nod to this as well, and other theorists have as well. You know, you have a combination of the best of excellence, that principle, and that's the aristocratic principle, and representation, the democratic principle. In short, a representative republic is a mixed form in that sense. But regardless, even that's a tool. Even that's only as good as you have that vibrant middle class, or more importantly, and what Aristotle did not see, is the image of God. If you have that rule of law, everybody focusing, because they can think on that level, focusing on the law, serving the image of God, not the other way around. And you have everything down on the floor in these faction groups. Well, other theorists give confirmation to this. One example, one of the, probably the most quoted thinker in Independence Hall, it was Montesquieu, the French political philosopher who wrote in 1750 his Spirit of the Laws, where Montesquieu says this, quote, "It is natural to a republic to have only a small territory. Otherwise it cannot long subsist." Stop. What did he just say? Well, he said what Aristotle said, but he put a finer point on it. Keep that small, or you're all going to die a horrible death. That's what he means by it cannot long subsist. What cannot long subsist? The gates that the barbarians are shaking. That's what cannot long. That's what we mean by a republic. Those structures and laws surrounding and protecting the image of God. So it is natural to a republic to have only a small territory. Otherwise, it cannot long subsist. In a large one, here's the other side of the principle. In a large one, if it's too large, if it's governing too much, there are men of large fortunes and consequently of less moderation. There are also great despots to trust in the hands of a single subject. An ambitious person soon becomes sensible that he may be happy, great, and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens, and that he might raise himself to grandeur on the ruins of his country. Now stop. At this point, you might be tempted again to hear Montesquieu the way you might have heard 1 Samuel 8 with Saul. Saul, bad guy. Here's what he's going to do because he's such a bad guy. Now that's true, but that's not the point. Lift the mind to the form of the tyrant. And here, the form of the tyrant, any tyrant, is exacerbated by the form of the flow of power which flows, as water seeks its lowest plane, by the form of the scope of the republic. The broader you put it, the more the floods of tyranny flow. Why? Montesquieu's telling you. He goes on. In large republics, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 views. In a small one, the interest of the public is easily perceived, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen. Lawnmowers in your garage. You take the responsibility for that. Or, if it's a few, together you can keep watch. You see that? In a small one, Montesquieu's saying, the interest of the public is easily perceived, better understood, more within the reach of every citizen. Abuses have less extent, and of course are less protected. You see that last part especially? Abuses, less protected. The image of God needs protection. But in sin, there's that totalizing tendency of the state and the deifying tendency of the statesman. Remember that from week 1? And so abuses start to protect themselves. But why would they do that? They're sinners, remember? And so we remember our doctrine of sin and we bring it into this flow of power. The abuses of runaway statism are insulated precisely by their size and distance. If that lawnmower boy who's a teenager wants to, for whatever reason, use the lawnmower for nefarious purposes, he is more able to do so the more people whose singular lawnmower he is maintaining and using and so forth. That's the parable. The size and the distance. Which size and distance are mutually exacerbated? In other words, big governments are big precisely insofar as they reign over more, spin a web of more laws, fortify their growing interest by labor unions to protect existing jobs, suggest more complex problems, and once those hooks are in their prey, to justify their existence and to justify further expansion, and in every other way, by the nature of the beast, become more remote, more exalted, and increasingly untouchable. Small republics, by contrast, restrain those tendencies. Small republics are small cages. The bars made up on fewer citizens. They're metal forged by classical thought. Thought about, thought upon immutable objects such as justice and the image of God. And those are meant to restrain the growth, the scope of what the governor governs. Republics, therefore, must be small. Its laws few, its philosophy deep, and its public virtue high. In other words, that whole republic, ma'am, if you can keep it, like Benjamin Franklin said, that cannot be kept if it is not kept small. That's what all the great political philosophers are saying for 2,500 years. Keep this thing small, or it will not be the same thing and it will crush you in the name of peace and brotherhood. How small? Well, Aristotle floats a couple numbers, and that's what I have in that circle. He says 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 at various points in the politics. But here I have 1,000, just to represent it, just to represent that cross-section right there. By the way, another practical lesson. If we played the game like this, that really is what the map would look like. You say, well, that is what the map looks like in terms of the electoral night and so forth and so on. Well, let me ask you a question. In any number of these red bubbles, do you govern like that in your red bubble? Why is it in your red bubble the socialists are in charge of everything in your little red bubble too? Why is it that you keep voting for the communist in the cowboy hat? Why is it that your public library has transvestite story hour, but you're in a red state? Why? Why all these whys? And the answer is very simple. You don't know how to play the game because you didn't learn civics. The reality is, if you did that, this map would look like this, and everything in the blue would stay in the blue. But nothing in the blue stays in the blue. It all gets in the red, doesn't it? Why is that? It's because This is not how you think. You were not taught to think like this. Now, what's the principle behind it? Well, it's this principle called subsidiarity, and let me write that on the board. The principle of subsidiarity. Now, let's do a little definition, a little etymology, and we'll talk about where this comes from and have a balanced view of it, because there's different concepts. I don't want to get them confused. In general, it's the organizing principle that matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, and least centralized competent authority. But it's mostly a political idea in that sense. Political decisions should be made at the local level if possible, rather than by a central authority. So anything that can be, should be. And it comes from both the Latin word and the use that it had in Roman law. Subsidium. And if you're familiar with subsistare versus existare, sub, you think under, but here it would mean sit or stand, and think of standby. So think of a parent. You want to be a good parent to your kid, you want them to grow. Increasingly, you're going to wean them off, to teach them to be let them do it, and don't overbearingly breathe over their shoulder on everything, because they'll never grow, they'll never exercise those muscles, and so on. And so in this principle is going to be a very moral principle having to do with dehumanization. Okay? Now in the Roman provincial government, the role of the subsidium, which is to sit behind, as I said, is for the larger structure only to help out when absolutely necessary, on standby, so that human beings could flourish as human beings in all of the things that makes humans human, unless you needed to be bailed out. So for example, if a band of marauding, Vikings or whoever else comes over your border, well then a larger force becomes necessary in a circumstance like that. You say, well, that's everything today because society is so complex. I understand the argument, and we'll come back to it. It actually works the other way around. However, this view was developed, I may have mentioned last time, at least in the last 200 years, more by Roman Catholic thinkers. And in particular, two papal encyclicals spoke about it. Rerum Novarum in 1891 by Leo XIII, and Quadragesimo Anno in 1931 by Pius XI. And listen to the language, and you'll see what I mean by it being a moral issue. Pius XI says, quote, "Just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them." So you see that healthy balance there. Now, speaking of balance, there's an unhealthy one, because I want to make a distinction. I want to draw a distinction between the Catholic subsidiarism, which at the time, in the early 20th century, in this encyclical and the older buildup of it, involved some wrong thinking. Now, the Pope here was trying to steer between what he regarded to be the two modern evils of collectivism, but also, on the other end, individualism. And so the more horizontal part of this theory, I'm going to have to draw something up, and my drawing I agree with. But there's a wrong way to mean it, and I don't want anybody to be turned off from the idea because of the wrong way to put it. There's sort of this vertical idea of subsidiarity where on the local level, the local state level, let's call this government, but it's local. You want the majority of power to flow down this way, right? Now, I say there's a horizontal, because what they want to, and what we've already said, is that there are different social institutions such as the family, labor. You could put other elements of culture in there, and then, of course, you have the church after afterwards. And what we want to suggest is that the individual, now they're going to say, that individualism and collectivism, as this collects up this way, as you reverse that, that's bad. But we also don't want to say that the individual is Robinson Crusoe here, that he's a man on his own and so forth. But man, as Aristotle said, is a social animal. Now, while we disagree with this philosophy, and it, you know, what it does is it takes, not that they intended to do this, but you'll notice the similarity between that and Abraham Kuyper's view within Dutch Calvinism of sphere sovereignty, which we could talk about more in detail another time. But what we want to say here that we agree with is that man is a social animal, and these, and even Milton Friedman said this, so if you libertarians are getting nervous at this point, understand that all this requires is to say that this person finds his identity not merely as a bald, bare individual, but as a father, as a husband, as a worker, as an elder or parishioner, you get the idea, as an artist. And so he exists within community. That's true. That doesn't make these equal and opposite errors. And so we're gonna push against that, but don't fly to the other extreme and miss what even Milton Friedman would have said, which is that these act as a buffer between the individual and the state. And if you don't know this, you're not going to be able to fight Marxism, and here's why. Is there any wonder why Marx called these kind of things opiate to the masses? It wasn't just religion, it was marriage, it was law, it was all these are props for the power class. If you don't understand this, you're not going to understand why Marxism takes its aim at that. What are they doing? They're dissolving these institutions that stand in between the individual and the state. Because the individual, if you don't understand this, just is a social being. He's going to want fraternity. He's a fraternity-seeking being. He finds his meaning in community with other people. But he does that voluntarily and not by force. It loses not only its virtue, but its nature, the way it works, okay? And so Marxism is going, statism in general is going to try to erode these so that the state becomes that. It's either going to be one or the other. If all you do is eliminate everything else besides this tug of war between the individual and the collective, the individual will get sucked up in that because he needs banners and anthems and causes. He just does. And so these things act as a buffer between the individual and the state. That's not all they are, but certainly they are not less than that. Okay? And so we move on here at this point. The point here is that, again, if you get lost, just come back to the lawnmower. Come back to that parable. Well, that's why it's there. It's simple. It makes it simple. But maximal liberty is proportionate to minimal and optimal government scope. Minimal, so they don't have too much power. Optimal, so that they do have a point. Let's talk about this balance for a second, and we'll end with this. A balance must be achieved to maximize the buffer between the image of God and the violence of force and fraud. And that balance seeks a couple of things. That balance seeks the most narrow scope of power over others toward self-government. If it's building up this way, it's maximizing power over others, not simply because now you have more people to be a busybody over, but rather because now power, your humanity is being, remember the lawnmower. If you get lost, remember the lawnmower. As it gets more distant and over more people, the extension, more power then goes to those who are entrusted with that. Less maintenance from the locale is happening, less of an eye on them. And so more violence has to be committed against each of those individuals. Hayek said there is little reason why the majority of the people who have joined for some purposes, be it a nation or some supranational organization, should be regarded as entitled to extend the scope of their power as far as they please. This balance also recognizes inequalities of power in individuals to defend themselves. And so you have a collective force like police and military. And we just don't agree with the idea, well, in the state of nature, everything's good. Well, it's good if you're big and you can make drones. Okay, but otherwise, no, it's not as good. And so there is a reason. You say, but government shouldn't exist because that implies force, and that's bad. Yes, but we live in a fallen, bad world. And if you saw somebody who's getting picked on, you would, I hope, come into their rescue and help them because they're small. You say, well, that's not organized, though. It just got organized the moment your courage was summoned. One just became two. And you say, well, but that's very rare. Okay, again, your doctrine of sin is non-existent at this point. Okay, we have government because we have sin. Oh, but that just shouldn't be because that's bad. Yeah. Now, this gets into, and this is where I'll close here, because this does get into the doctrine of the lesser magistrate that we've introduced. And we've looked at passages like Romans 13 in light of Genesis 9, Deuteronomy 17, and other passages in the historical books where Rutherford made a lot of these arguments. And unfortunately, because we've run out of time, we're not going to see how the principle of subsidiarity relates to the lesser magistrate, but hopefully your imagination can start to see it already. This is that social sphere on the local level where they are charged to defend all of this from what? From any enemy, foreign or domestic. And is that on your radar screen in terms of local elections? Because that's where the game is played. I said you don't know how to play the game. It'll start right there with that doctrine of the lesser magistrate. But here's the principle behind it: subsidiarity.